I'm not the hammer for which everything is a nail. I'm sort of the guy who's running around with a screwdriver with all those little bits and different types, trying to find the right tools and the right fasteners in order to build things together. And what I've done through about 10 years at Apple is try and guide different companies who are looking to diversify into newer, better, off-the-shelf, faster, open standards, QuickTime-based, Windows Media type, nonlinear editing, offline, proxy-based, file-based, analog, digital, DLT, Betacam, SP, 3/4 inch workflows, and try and cobble all of those things into a $1,300 piece of software running on a $3,000 piece of hardware that the year before cost $150,000 to do the same job. So that's sort of what I've been doing for the last decade. And I had a really good time at Apple helping people figure out different ways of getting some of those things done. So at Apple, I was a QuickTime evangelist. I worked in the Pro Apps team. I helped introduce Final Cut to the marketplace. I brought Final Cut into professional video for broadcast and post-production. It was really this cute little thing that everybody thought was great for independent movies for a couple of years, and we took it beyond that. So I'm a firm believer in digital imagery long before it was popular. Okay, that's really the setup. So let's move it forward here. Okay, so as was said in the setup, and as was said, I believe, in a press announcement before we got here, I was involved with a major sports organization who hired me away from Apple and said basically, you know, what you've been helping people to do on behalf of Apple, we'd like you to come here and do for us. We think there's a better way to do an awful lot of what we do. We're putting out hundreds and thousands of hours of content literally on a seasonal basis. Our season is 10 months long per year. And we do hundreds of events, we broadcast them. But we also, which is unusual about this sport, is we are also not just the sort of the NFL football, but we're also the NFL films. We own our own archive. We are our own arbiters of the sport, which makes them very unusual compared to some of the other sports leagues, compared to what they call the typical sports, stick and ball sports. So they came at me and said, we've already invested in Spectra and some other technologies to start porting over 50 or 60 years of the sport to digital files. What we haven't been able to do, and this was really an interesting challenge, is we haven't been able to figure out how to work our way backwards up to the analog editing that we're still doing on Beta SP and the acquisitions we're doing out of the track. So they finished their archive process and leapfrogged and started bringing all the 50 years of history forward, but everything in the middle was still not connected. So we had two entirely different systems that I inherited, and my job was to bring them all together into an HD-based workflow, continue to port the SD stuff, and oh gee, by the way, these 50 or 60 years of 40 weeks worth of racing across 4 or 5 different leagues of the sport, I want to be able to find every single frame forever. And I want to do it now, and I want to do it cheaply, and I want people who are not terribly bright or sophisticated to be able to log this stuff. Right? So the challenges were amazing. And by and large, I'll tell you, we pulled it off. We did a really sort of amazing job in about 2 years with a budget that, of course, because the last couple of years has been challenging, my budget was whacked about 30% from the day I agreed to do it, and I relocated out there to do it, to the day we finally turned the key on it, and it still managed to come in under budget. So it was a fun project. Okay. Somebody's going to have to keep me honest on time also, because I'll do my thing here. Okay, so we built a new facility. Those were very good. Thanks. State-of-the-art facility. Built a new facility. Okay, so in building a state-of-the-art facility, I literally did sort of put together a guide, right? And our main concerns in building the guide was to get as much buy-in from as many people as I possibly can. It was like herding cats, right? I have the business people who are basically saying, you're spending millions and millions of our dollars in order to do this. We need to understand the return on investment right away. Don't tell me about what's going to do for you in the sports for 10 or 20 years. Tell me what you can do for me right away. Okay, what I'm going to do for you, Mr. Businessman, is I'm going to tell you where all of your clips are right now so you can monetize things that you've owned for 50 years but you couldn't find if your life depended on it. That's going to be one thing I do for you. But then the creative people are like, well, I can make a much more creative project if I can show people things that I've not been able to access for all those years. So the archive was key, but I also had to give that same level of flexibility to things that were being recorded in the last 15 minutes and being recorded from 38 cameras at 200 miles an hour. So it definitely had some challenges to get all those angles and put everything together. And we came up with a roadmap which has still not been implemented, and to the best of my knowledge, not implemented anywhere, but it's still my holy grail to do someday in a project, which is to do time slices by frame of absolutely every piece of asset or metadata known about that project at that time. So basically, if I've got 38 things whirling around a track at 180 miles an hour, I know only one thing. I know exactly what was being recorded at a particular time code reference frame, whether that's 60 frames or 30 or 24, whatever. And I want to be able to find everything that I know about that. I want to know the geospatial location of the camera and of the targets. I want to know the location of the track in the global positioning. I want to know where the camera was facing and what angle it came from, what format it was recorded by, who was the operator at that time of the day. And I want all of that in my asset management system, and I want to be able to access anything simply by knowing the frame of time. And we've built a system that will eventually be able to sustain that. I just can't get it all to happen fast enough. Some of the workflow components, in terms of what we had to acquire, were actually very easy to choose, right? You've got some traditional heavy metal broadcasting partners that are out there. You have some in the more recent 5 or 10 year period of time, traditional hardware in the computer space vendors that made a lot of sense. Apple on the editing side, maybe on some of the ingest or capture side. Some of the bigger storage vendors, a lot of this was really easy to figure out. Some of it wasn't, but how to wire it all together, that was what was the intellectual property that we were developing. And it is also that intellectual property that is owned by the folks that I was working for at that time. So while you're hearing me dance a little bit about who I was working for and exactly how we did some of what we did, if I work for you, hopefully you appreciate that same sensitivity. So we'll try. We were able to figure out an awful lot of what we needed to do, and some of it, especially in terms of the capacities of the system, seemed like they would be the easiest parts, right? X amount of streams of video being ingested, X amount of spindles capable of X amount of data moving across X amount of IOs. It should have been very, very simple. So I proceeded down that road, assuming this has all been tried and true. All of the partner vendors out there in the market space all seem to have all of the answers that I needed in order to get all my data into the system, because again, what we were building, because of the archive and the real-time assets and the 38 editing systems that were online and the 30 or 40 offline and HD where it had been SD and the different file formats and then the multiple deliveries, it was all math, right? I mean, it's just simple math. It should have just been that simple. If it were that simple, then I wouldn't have a story to tell you. So let's keep going. Okay, I'm going to show you this just so you can have an idea of, well, of course, this doesn't line up with mine, so this isn't going well. This is an example of an HD Sports workflow. And this is really interesting because you can see that there's not just one type of storage. There is not just one type of client. We'll see a slide a little farther down gives you an even clearer example of that. But here is, in microcosm, the world that we had to build. And while this is indicative of some of the workflow that we had, it's not unique to this particular sport. HD ingest, the lady at Spectra spoke earlier and elegantly about the need to have a particular type of storage at your acquisition on top, and then you have to work your way down through that pyramid. That turned out to be the greatest truth of all of the truths of what we were building, is there had to be a tremendous amount of flexibility in how you built and what you expected of your storage in order to achieve the goals, right? Ingesting all of that video live off of satellites, multiple streams coming in, either MPEG-4 and MPEG-2, and occasionally even baseband through traditional ground sources, all had to be recorded in real time. But then I had to make sure people could edit it and have access to it and turn it around for a rebroadcast through a switcher, also in real time. So that's two very different needs, right? Editing is a different format and different use than an ASI baseband feed coming in. So all phraseology that you may not know or may not care about, but suffice to say that I had multiple clients for my stuff in real time, all the time. This is an example of how I transcoded, how we ingested through the first box, how it gets edited on the SAN, how it gets proxied on the transcoding boxes, and then I have to put it out either as Flash, Windows Media QuickTime, and again, all of that had to happen within either milliseconds or virtually seconds of real time for an awful lot of this content. So I think that's a little bit different than moving database files through your average bank or business. All right, so we started working, knowing what our requirements were, and our first attempt at building out the storage had me going through what I believed to be was the most logical thing I could do. I had the resources, I had the intellectual property and the prowess to go and find some of the really big bucks providers, some of whom were on this panel today, who have expertise in moving around massive amounts of data and who were absolutely sure and showed me some case studies and examples of large implementations where they would be able to handle the workflow and the workload. And they were instrumental in helping me design the workflow, some of it around their product. Went through an awful lot of due diligence. I'd say virtually before we turned to screw, it was probably a full year's worth of work, certainly 10 months before we wrote a purchase order. So this was not something we slapped together overnight. I definitely had enough time to try and do this right. With that said, the project was aggressive. It was actually 24 months, and I would only have a month and a half in between seasons in order to physically move facilities and start the brand new workflow untested. One of the interesting things that I've talked about here, I won't spend too much time on the slide, is just the specific challenges to broadcast that most people don't have to count on. And it is the varying needs of multiple clients in real time sets this kind of workflow apart, especially because broadcast is quite literally real time. This isn't record the game, turn it around in a day or two or a week. It's record the game and edit the highlights and then show the slow-mos back in real time while the game is still going on. Oftentimes retransmitting 15 minutes behind real time so that Europe gets the whole race, or event down the road. So the demands are very, very different. So in addition to being able to record all of my HD in real time, I have to be able to spit it back out in real time. I'm not going to duplicate the data that time, so I'm going to have to hit those disks twice to do the same task or the same size task. Okay. The result of my first effort was to crash and burn pretty badly. I did all of the math. I had all of the testimonials from all of my vendor partners and my storage partners about how to do this and to stratify it and how to do it. And ultimately, the system completely fell over. And it took us a couple of months to realize that there was no solution using the existing technology that I had, working with the existing vendor partners that I had, other than the vendor partner saying to me, well, you know what, you're going to need to buy a lot more of this. And that should do it. So that was reassuring after a couple $1 million into the project, and with a deadline coming in a broadcast world. So we sort of regrouped and said, you know what, I need to virtualize the system. I need to put something in front of this workflow that is going to make a bit more generic what it's writing out to the disk systems. But I also needed to rethink who my partners were. I needed to think about, this really is a unique business. This really is a unique demand in broadcast, and bigger is not necessarily better. Who do I normally go to when I have questions about video workflow? I don't normally go to non-video people. I don't ask broadcast questions of IT professionals. I find video professionals. And there is a very unique segment of the world that is growing into this media and creative market space, where it is a true hybrid of education that makes for the most powerful solutions. And I had to go and find different vendors who had worked with Avid, who had worked with Apple, who had worked with Adobe in media. And we started redoing our math and started redoing our calculations. And it was no longer just about spindle counts. It was no longer just about IOs and IOPS. It became about the entire workflow and what was it I needed to do at what point in the workflow. And when I started pulling the workflow apart instead of the overall aggregate need for storage, things began to come together very quickly. So we took another whack at this, and now we're getting a little desperate for time considerations. And we took another whack at our system, and we reparsed it completely. We took it almost down to the nuts and bolts again, to the point where we even had to physically relocate where some of these things were in relationship to the ingest systems and the playout systems and the switching systems and the HD routing order system. And we took a whole new approach to this. And not just again from the storage, but we had to rethink everything. And in doing that, we reconfigured into something that looks like this. Now, there are different storage vendors involved in the solution that I built. The original investment that I made of what was supposed to have been my tier 1 and tier 2, I reprioritized to be entirely tier 2. I then went to a much smaller video-specific vendor capable of much higher data rates in more sustainable speeds in order to do my ingest and my acquisition and my highest quality online 2K, 4K, HD, 1080p, 720p editing, 1080i editing. And I stratified them at the top. And once I knew that I had captured all of my bits and no longer had to worry about dropped frames, I was then able to think about all of my other processes being just a few seconds behind it, and that was the difference of what I needed. I needed to work with somebody who really understood what it was like to move massive amounts of video in large chunks as opposed to very small pieces of data, including even metadata. Metadata was never anything that was going to cause my system to fall over. So again, this is an idea of the scale of what we were talking about in terms of being able to get all these things done. And working with the archive and all of the asset management tools was just icing on the cake, right? That was a whole set of other challenges. How am I doing for time? Fabulous, I have fun. So moving through, and I'm doing pretty well on my slides, we were able to achieve a win for this organization. Now, let me slow down a little bit here and tell you what a win means, right? A win means that not only did we come in on time and under budget. Yes, we had a very stressful year in order to debug an awful lot of this stuff. Yes, there are still going to be tweaks and things going on. But again, the difference in this kind of a deliverable for most is I had a season that was going to start in January of this past year, exactly a year ago. I had an awful lot of needs and clients and web streams and satellite feeds and events and edit projects and movies that had to be taken out of all of this content. So the timing element, I want it good, I want it fast, and I want it now, sort of, while it's cute, is really annoying when business wants it good, but they really want it cheap. And the producers, they want it great, but they also have to have it now. And then the broadcast element is, that's all really fine and good, and I like it to look good, but at the end of the day, it's gonna happen at 6 o'clock on Saturday, and none of that else is negotiable. Everybody gets to go home if we blow one start date, one start time. It was not an option. So a win means being able to satisfy all of those needs day one in a brand new facility with a brand new workflow with vendor partners, some of whom you know and you trust, and some you've never worked with before, and some who have shown up to help you when the chips were down, and some who said, nah, I know we did this together, but really you just need to buy more. And me not really wanting to go back to the management of the organization and saying, you know that 11,400,000? It's going to be more like 12 million. And you know, I can't really guarantee it's still going to work because nobody's ever done this before. So doubling the amount of spindles should work, but hell, they told me it was supposed to work the first time. So what does a win mean? A win means that I was able to fire this thing up ahead of time, show them all of these processes working, show them offline editing, online editing, proxy generation in real time, putting out streams in Flash server, in Windows Media, and in QuickTime, putting all of the review copies, all of the logging material that had to be done in H.264 and simple profile. And I had to move a tremendous amount of data through the system all the time. By the way, nothing's allowed to fail, right? Ever. So you constantly have to be cycling through all of your workflows and your processes in order to make sure that nothing goes wrong, or at least if it's going to go wrong, it goes wrong in a predictable way so that you can fail over. Okay. So that was what a win meant for us, and a win for me meant finishing a 2-year project on time and under budget and having built something that never existed before and actually seeing it work. Not bad. Okay. So some of the lessons that I learned, understanding the very real need of what your workflow actually is, while it sounds silly, was the key. I started this project thinking I understood what the workflow requirements were, and I was wrong. It wasn't until I broke the workflow down into the elements of how they needed to be ingested and consumed and processed did I really finally understand what my workflow was. So I started out with good intentions, but a wrong approach. It wasn't until I changed the approach that I was able to pull things together. And again, this is not isolated. Please don't, I hope I don't sound grandiose. This was not something I figured out on my own. I really had to go to the market again and start asking video people, how do video people do this? And then I went to them and said, okay, that's what you've done in the past. Now let's do that 10x and see if it works. Now let's do it 50x and see if it works. When you start moving petabytes of data around, it gets pretty daunting even for big vendors. Okay, lesson number 2 was establish your best practices early and often. A best practice is not something that's engraved in stone a year before you write your first purchase order. That was something else I learned. Just because I had a roadmap didn't mean it wasn't going to change. Just because we had all agreed on everything at a corporate level didn't mean that they weren't going to turn around to me 60 days before launch and say, it would be really cool if we could do this. And no, we don't have any more money for it. So you constantly have to be on your game. You constantly have to be open and willing to be flexible within the confines of the workflow. Not always within the confines of the technology, because the people who are paying bills don't give a damn about your technological limitations. They really don't. And at $11,400,000, they don't really think they have to. And then the final part of this was I also sort of had to deal with the transition of SD to HD, all of the additional bandwidth and math requirements that was going to take. How do you archive all of that stuff? How do I get it off to tape but also bring it back from tape when I need to? How do you figure out what goes to tape? How do you set up a life management routine that makes sense in a real-time production environment? So we tried the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of whatever we used on a weekly basis was really the last 20% of what we recorded into the system. Except when it wasn't. Except when the producer sitting in the truck says, that crash 15 years ago was this guy's fault. Why don't we get that now? And we had to build a system for extremes. And while that works, it's still not as elegant as we would like. But again, some of what I heard today about Spectra and your archive solution sounds like something that 3 years ago really would have been something I would have counted on. I'd like to learn more about it. Sounds great. So those are some of the challenges, and I'm going to start winding my way down here. We can get into Q&A if anybody has any questions. I wanted to show this chart to you. This is probably nothing new for some of you, but maybe shocking for some of the rest of us, to give you an idea of what are the speeds and feeds and the kind of math that we're looking at. And again, if you extrapolate this into hours and hundreds, if not thousands of hours of storage and content as opposed to just bits and bytes, it becomes very daunting very quickly. Okay, these similar charts to this exist in, I think, in Tom's reports from years gone by. So there's nothing new here, but I just wanted to show it as the kind of thing that we had to factor in as we were trying to do our math. How much content is from the archive from the last 50 years? How much are we recording on a weekly basis that's now in HD? What format of HD? Do we really care if it's HD, or does it have to be 2K? Or are we shooting film for these really special events? That's going to be more like a 2K or a 4K ingest. How do you do all of that math unless you know exactly what you're recording? And how do you know what you're recording a year ahead in a live sports production environment? Lots of considerations. My name is Jeff Lowe. I'm with NASCAR Media Group, and I am the Managing Director of Broadcast Operations and Technology there. The NASCAR Media Group is responsible for all of the live video and post-produced video that goes through the NASCAR motor racing sport industry. It is tons and tons of live video elements shot every week, 38 weeks a year, plus the entire 50-year archive of the sport. And we move a field deployment, something in excess of what is required to put on the Super Bowl. We built truly a state-of-the-art system. This started out to be almost a $40 million project, and we really spared no expense. I chose Active Storage because I needed a vendor who really understood HD size professional video. So it was not a dollars and cents issue, it was a quality of vendor issue. The Active Storage was the missing ingredient from something that was pretty well architected. If you think about your usual data, it's all pebbles that you could easily lift and move millions of. But when it comes to the video production business, it's like trying to move boulders. And you need a dump truck to move those boulders. And if you don't choose a storage vendor that understands that, you're never going to have a workflow that can support your needs. And no matter how much I tried to work with other vendors, they really did not understand the requirements of such massive file sizes being cranked through a system on a daily basis. If somebody were considering one of the competitive products to Active Storage, I would wish them well, but strongly recommend that they slow down, take a breath, and take a look at what Active offers. When they came in to try and help us solve what was an existing problem in my facility, not only did they send in a few people to try and analyze our problem and see if they thought that they could do better than what I was getting, but they also looked at my entire workflow and not just the parts of it that only mattered to them, because they felt that a holistic understanding of what it is I was trying to do was going to be the key to the success. And they were absolutely right. Subsequently, I've turned to Active again and asked for their opinion and guidance on how to refine my workflow, even though I've already made my investment with them. Not every storage vendor in the industry understands what professional video requirements are. Active does. Active gets it. They really do.